Good morning and welcome to the last special lecture of the cycle, The Contribution of Vernaculars to the Rise of New Cultural Participation in Europe and Asia. Today we have, as Dulcis in Fundo, we have one of the most informed and prepared scholars at international level about vernacularization, about cosmopolitanism, about the debate of the still ongoing debate on cosmopolitan languages and East Asian vernaculars. Professor Ross King from the University of British Columbia. Professor King is Ross King is professor of Korean at the University of British Columbia. His research focuses on the cultural and social history of language, writing, and literary culture in Korea and in the Sinographic cosmopolis more broadly, with a particular interest in comparative histories of vernacularization. He serves as editor-in-chief of Songyun Journal of East Asian Studies, as managing editor of the Korean Studies Library, Brill, and as co-editor with David Lurie and Marion Eggert of the series Language, Writing, and Literary Culture in the Sinographic Cosmopolis, also published by Brill. He is the editor of Cosmopolitan and Vernacular in the World of When, reading Sheldon Pollock from the Sinographic Cosmopolis. Then he is also the author of I Thank Korea for Her Books, James Scarf Gale, Korean Literature in Hanmun, and in Allo-Metropolitan Missionary Orientalism, which is forthcoming at university published by the University of Toronto Press. Today's talk will be, of course, is entitled Vernacularizing the Cosmopolitan, Regional Sanskrits, Stuffed Latin, Variant Sinitic, and the Problem of Hybridity. And the poster is accompanied by a curious and indeed very beautiful photo of pearls of different colors, different shapes, different sizes. So these are the pearls that I guess we will listen from him. These are pearls that create hybridity and create all the various vernaculars. So I leave the floor to Professor King, and I hope and I wish that this lecture will be as much interesting as all the others of this cycle have been. So please, Professor King, come to the floor and present us your talk. Oh, and by the way, I also wish to thank all the students, because this is the last lecture. I also wish to thank deeply all the students that have followed us in this wonderful journey in vernacularization. And I also wish to thank the Eurasia Foundation once again, the Eurasia Foundation, for the precious support they have granted us.
May I turn on the camera?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Here you go.
Yeah. Okay. It's this false, so I think you have to.
Adesso professoressa vedono lei, forse sarebbe il
lo
caso
so.
di spostarsi di
Stavo
sedia.
facendo.
Sì, sì. Con calma, non potete vedere.
Okay, let me see. Okay. So let me fire that up. Is that working?
Yeah.
Okay. And is the audio okay? Everybody's good with the audio? Okay, let me start then. So first of all, thank you, Vincenza, for the invitation. Now I can cross your beautiful city off my bucket list, although I hope it's not the last time I visit. And I'm also very grateful for the support that your support staff has given me. And I'm also very pleased to see Professor Song Hyung-gun, my old friend, Professor Song, in the audience. And and I'm also a little mortified that as many as 40 undergraduates are listening to this. And this is the first time I've presented on this particular paper. So it might be a little bit rough, but am I correct in understanding that I shouldn't go more than an hour?
No, 1.5 is okay.
Okay, I don't know how long it will take. I mean, I'm not going to rush.
Take all the time
Okay.
you need.
So then, without any further ado, let's start. So this image on the screen is this volume, Cosmopolitan and Vernacular in the World of One, reading Sheldon Pollock from the Sinographic Cosmopolis, which literally is just hot off the press. It has only just been published. It took some 12 years to complete the volume. And I myself have not physically held a copy of this book in my hands. I'm still waiting for the copies to arrive. But so this talk that I'm presenting today is one of my chapters in this volume. In case you're wondering, this is what Professor Sheldon Pollock looks like, although the photograph is some years old. He is a professor of Sanskrit at Columbia University in the city of New York. Before that was professor of Sanskrit at the University of Chicago. He's a very distinguished Sanskritist, which goes without saying. But what's really unusual about him is that he's also a formidable theoretician. I mean, he's a theorist, and he engages with all the big, heavy hitters in social theory, and publishes articles in journals like Critical Theory and so on. And so he's not, if you will, not just a Sanskritist, if you could. It's not a fair thing to say about anybody, but he speaks to theoretical and methodological issues that go far beyond South Asia, and needs to be taken very seriously by those of us who work in East Asia. And I discovered his work about the year 2006. And so I've been sort of paying attention to him now for almost 20 years. And one thing about his work, just to get us going here with some terminology, in his early work, he used to refer to the South Asian kind of literary sphere as what he called the Sanskrit ecumeny or ecumene, depending on how you pronounce it. And in yeah, in English, I hear both people. I hear ecumeny and ecumene. But anyway, the term comes from anthropology and is defined as a nuclear area of high culture to which neighboring regions stand in a relation of cultural backwardness or dependence. And so he later, and that's how he spoke about this in his earlier work, and then come about 2006, when he publishes his big fat book called The Language of the Gods and the World of Men, he changes the term to Sanskrit cosmopolis, where this term cosmopolis brings together two etymons. So cosmos meaning the world, the universe, and then polis for city, this idea of meaning that they're highlighting a political dimension to these so-called cosmopolitan or kind of supra-local languages. So anyway, he talks about a Sanskrit cosmopolis. In my work over the last 15 years, I have tried to promote the idea that we should not talk about a sinosphere, which is a word that I hate because it doesn't really signal anything, but talk about a sinographic cosmopolis, because what defined our region in pre-modern times was the common usage of sinography or so-called Chinese characters to write not just literary Sinitic, but many other vernaculars. So I've tried to adopt this term, the sinographic cosmopolis. And it's gaining some traction, but not everybody likes it. Some people are more neutral and talk about the sinographic sphere, but I prefer sinographic cosmopolis because there were very specific aesthetic and political concerns that one automatically bought into if one was reading classical Chinese texts. So that's another topic. So this volume that my paper today is coming out of, this Cosmopolitan and Vernacular in the World of One, just to give you an idea. And in theory, your library should very quickly have a copy of it, meaning that you should be able to download the PDFs for it. So it starts off, the volume starts off with a long introductory chapter by me, essentially comparing this idea of applications of Pollock's ideas about cosmopolitan and vernacular, not just in East Asia, but around the world. My colleague David Lurie has an excellent essay trying to determine to what extent Pollock's model works for us in East Asia. The same goes for Vibke Denneke. It's more of a conceptual and theoretical chapter. And then chapter 4 is the chapter that I'm presenting today in very sort of abbreviated form. There follows a kind of middle section where Saito Mareshi, who teaches at the University of Tokyo, talks about this early concept of ya yen in very early Chinese writing. Torkel Duffy, a chapter on Japan and waka poetry. John Jorgensen's paper, he calls them secondary or specialized cosmopolitan languages. He's talking about Baihua or Pekwa in Korean, because its very existence in some ways challenges the scheme that Pollock has been using when it's applied to East Asia. Alexei Lushenko talks about a series of biographies of Hideyoshi, essentially all the same content, if you will, the same text, but written in very different ways, whether in Kambun or in Japanese or in something in between. Again, to question how we think about the sort of spectra or continua of different kinds of more cosmopolitan or more vernacular renditions of a text. We do have 2 chapters on Vietnam, one by John Phan and the other by Yufan Chang. And finally, the last 7 or 8 chapters of the volume focus on Korea. And so that my student Scott Wells has a really excellent introductory essay about literary Sinitic or Hanmun in Korea. Greg Yvonne's paper gives us this really excellent term, script apartheid. So if you have any familiarity with pre-modern Korean so-called Kojan Sosal, if a text is in Hangul, it's all in Hangul. If a text is in Hanmun, if it's a narrative, it's a fictional narrative. If it's all in Hanmun, it's all in Hanmun. Never shall the twain mix, no mixing whatsoever. So he talks about what is it with this script apartheid in fiction in pre-modern Korea. So then chapter 13 is another chapter by me on Chosan-shik Hanmun or Chosan style Hanmun, and is essentially the follow-on to the paper that I'm going to present today. And then my student Shine Park has a very interesting chapter about the genre of yadam in late Chosun. These are fictional narratives, although oftentimes loosely based in reality. They're in Hanmun, so-called. They're in literary Sinitic, but they're in a very peculiar register of literary Sinitic, and she wants to call these stories Korea's vernacular story, which is a very provocative and deliberately provocative term following Patrick Hannon's work on the vernacular story in China, because the stories are full of vernacular diction, vernacular terminology, and even use of sinography to write the vernacular. So that's her paper. Eggert has a paper on Pak Ji-won. An Dae-hui, my colleague at Sungkyunkwan, has a very nice paper summarizing a lot of what Korean intellectuals were writing as they wrestled with this, what they perceived this gap. We speak Korean, but we're writing in Hanmun. What's up with that? So he collects a lot of the interesting statements by Chosun literati, and then finally, Hwang Woo-deok, also from Sungkyunkwan, brings it right into the 20th century and the shift towards Japanese and sort of the new configuration of how signography and especially sinographs were functioning in modernizing Korea. So that's sort of an overview of this volume from which today's paper is taken. Okay, so let's then jump into the paper itself. So if we're going to talk about regionalizing cosmopolitan codes, we should start with a definition. I'm sure over the course of the last other 19 lectures, you've heard many different definitions of the term vernacularization, and there are many ways to define it. But if we, in Pollock's definition, vernacularization means the processes by which individuals or royal courts choose, and it's a very conscious choice, choose to write down and eventually to write literature in previously unwritten, therefore unlitterized and unlitterarized languages that had not previously been used to create literature. So this is kind of a loose but working definition of vernacularization following Pollock. And then he also comes up with something he calls the cosmopolitan vernacular, but by which he means any local language which aspires to cultural dominance by appropriating features of a superposed language. So if you think of Dante in his famous work written in Latin about the eloquence of the De Eloquenti, yeah, that one. This idea that a vernacular essentially bootstraps itself or pulls itself up by its bootstraps in emulation of a superposed cosmopolitan language, in this case, Italian and Latin, in an attempt to eventually displace and take over the place or the functions of the cosmopolitan language. So that he calls a cosmopolitan vernacular. And this is the process that he describes both in South Asia and in Europe, or in what was Latinitas in his book. And he further defines this idea of a cosmopolitan vernacular as a synthetic register of an emergent regional literary language. And I'm having trouble just seeing what's on my screen because of this. Second, I'm going to get rid of that. There we go. That localizes the full spectrum of expressive qualities of the superposed cosmopolitan code. So he's focusing on the way that new vernaculars come into being by explicit emulation and copying of a superposed cosmopolitan language. Okay, but then so the question I've always had is, what about the other side of the coin? What about the ways in which ostensibly cosmopolitan languages and texts can either mask or be infused with or infected with or co-opted by or somehow mixed and hybridized with vernaculars? So in other words, rather than talking about a vernacular that has risen up from by copying a cosmopolitan text, what about all these cases we have where cosmopolitan texts are essentially invaded by or infected by or somehow eroded by the vernacular? And unfortunately, Pollock doesn't really talk much about this. So he has little to say about the question of regional admixture, whether it's in Sanskrit or in Latin. And his excuse for this, his excuse for not talking about it, is that he says, quote, the conservatism and uniformity of Latin literary culture were as characteristic of Sanskrit as its widespread geographical diffusion. In other words, he's really focusing only on the extreme high registers, the purest sort of exponents that we have of these texts. And this is also true, by the way, of scholarship in South Korea today. Most scholars in South Korea who work on Hanmun focus only on the very most exquisite representative authors and pieces by pre-modern Korean authors, when in fact the vast majority of production by Koreans in Hanmun was not of that super refined, super excellent quality. It was a very different in between, and it was often infected with vernacular elements. But anyway, so Pollock, he's really focusing on what he calls kavya, or this very highest register of Sanskrit. So what about then these cases where this alleged conservatism and uniformity of a cosmopolitan code is breached or undermined, and what do we do with those? So that's kind of what my paper is about, and it's more conceptual. It's more thinking about, or at least examining how scholars today and actors in the past have approached this question of hybridization. So the questions then that I'm asking in this paper are, what are some of the metaphors that modern researchers use to understand these cases of essentially infected cosmopolitan? And how did local actors conceptualize these regionalized or locally inflected versions of a cosmopolitan code in traditional traditional times in traditional literary cultures? How have these meta-linguistic conceptions changed over time, if we can trace those kinds of developments? How are we to understand these cases of hybridization? And especially, how do questions of script and writing system complicate our comparisons? Because after all, in our region, it's all sinography and very different from either the Sanskrit world or Latinitas. So let's start with Sanskrit. And I will say right away that I'm not an expert in Sanskrit, although once upon a time I did take a course or two in Sanskrit at university. But so if you go back to Hertel 1922, he's writing about what he calls popular Sanskrit. And he complains, he says, the study of popular Sanskrit has quite unduly been neglected by the scholars, and it widely differs from that of the classical authors. Sort of similar to what I just described about the way modern day Korean scholars of Hanmun study Hanmun text. He said, and the texts that Hertel was studying were all from Gujarat. He said a certain knowledge of the Gujarati language is absolutely necessary for every scholar who wishes to read Sanskrit works written in Gujarat, because they're inflected with various elements from Gujarati. Then we have the famous Louis Renou, the French Sanskritist, in his Histoire de la langue Sanskrite, who talks about Buddhist Sanskrit. And he says, he describes it as kitchen Sanskrit. He said, because the utilization of Sanskrit by the Buddhists strongly resembles that of Latin by Christians keen to popularize a literary language, meaning popularized by injecting elements from the vernacular. And so he calls it kitchen Sanskrit. And then we have examples of what is often referred to as hybrid Sanskrit, typically exemplified by Jaina writers. And this is true especially in tales and fictional narratives. And there is quite a literature on this, and the Jains in particular are famous for this kind of hybridized Sanskrit. Deshpande, who has written a great deal on this, writes about what he calls vernacular Sanskrit, and he says those of us who work on Sanskrit should focus on the reality of the Sanskrit language as it actually existed, rather than on the Sanskrit language as it is expected to be, as it is described, for example, in Panini's grammar, and so on. And Bronner and Schulman, these are both students of Professor Pollock, these two scholars. They have worked on Sanskrit in South India, so therefore Sanskrit in contact with Dravidian languages, and they ask what is regional about regional Sanskrit, and they also complain that their professor Pollock has not really paid attention to these questions. So for them, a regional Sanskrit work is one that aims at a local audience, which of course is the opposite of cosmopolitan, which is translocal in its approach. But they also point out that vernacular metrical schemes penetrate into Sanskrit, and they point out that Dravidian languages have something called head rhyme, and that you find head rhyme, in fact, in South Asian and South Indian, therefore, Dravidian Sanskrit texts. It is very interesting, and in fact, there are North Korean scholars claiming to find vernacular Korean prosody in Hanshi. As part of the North Korean take on this. I won't have time to talk about it today, but it has been claimed also for certain kinds of Hanshi that they are inflected with vernacular rhythms and prosody as opposed to typical Yulshi, Korean Hanshi type prosody. So then Bronner and Schulman, they ask what they want to know, to what extent these linguistic entities that we think of as so neatly bounded and distinct, namely Sanskrit, Tamil, Telugu, etc., were they really truly separate in the minds of those who use them? And this is a really key question. It's a question that continues to bother me because I am increasingly of the persuasion that in pre-modern Korea, Hanmun was not conceived of as a foreign language, at least not in the way that we modern people define a foreign language, that it was just one endpoint on a kind of continuous spectrum or a continuum of different registers of language, and that it was not conceived of as a foreign language. And this is something that, it's a kind of question that people are asking in South Asia as well. I don't know that we'll ever have a really excellent answer to it, but just even to ask the question, I think is useful. So still on Sanskrit here, and we were talking about South India and the Dravidian languages, but the Dravidian South has always been kind of an Achilles heel for Pollock's work, in the sense that it poses a number of challenges to his overall narrative about vernacularization. And one place where it gets a little bit tricky for him is this, it's a 14th century grammar, or rather, it's a literary grammar. It's called the Lila Tilaka, and it's talking about a literary style that is called Mani Pravala. And so this scholar, Brau, in 1947, says, oh, this has an exact parallel with European macaronic style because it brings together Sanskrit and a Dravidian language, which later would come to be called Malayali. And so the metaphor here is lapidary. So the mani, I think, is the pearls, and the pravalam is the coral. And this is what this image for the poster is that the pearls are meant to represent Sanskrit because the pearls are the more precious, and the coral are the vernacular elements. But what's interesting about, as with everything in South Asia, the Indians theorized everything to an extremely high level. And so this particular text here, this Lila Tilaka, essentially was a theorization of hybridization of Sanskrit with the local Dravidian language, which later came to be known as Malayalam. And so that's where this particular image comes from. And it's a really interesting metaphor and sort of conceptual way to approach hybridization. In this case, where it actually did lead to a cosmopolitan vernacular, if you follow Pollock's story. So then the question is, well, what's the difference between a vernacularized cosmopolitan, or a cosmopolitan language that has been infused with vernacular elements, and a cosmopolitan vernacular in Pollock's terms, which has successfully kind of reinvented itself in the image of Sanskrit or Latin or perhaps even literary Sinitic? So what's the difference? How do you differentiate them? And so Rao is another scholar who works on Dravidian languages, and he follows Pollock in understanding this Mani Pravala register as a cosmopolitan vernacular, in the sense that it paved the way for the amalgamation of Sanskrit into the Western, I guess, Tamil dialects, which eventually crystallized as the language that we know today as Malayalam. So Rao follows him. But there's a German scholar called Tiken who has been the most vociferous critic of Pollock, and it's written very long and quite nasty reviews about Pollock's work, where he takes the opposite view. He says, what we have here in this case of this Mani Pravala, the pearls and coral, it's a gradual process of a vernacular encroaching upon a well-established literary language. So he rejects Pollock's narrative for vernacularization within South Asia and the Sanskrit cosmopolis. And he says, quote, the process of vernacularization may thus be characterized as a form of Sanskritization, with the vernaculars taking on the cloak of Prakrit or Abhabramsha. So for him, it's the opposite. No, these are a language like Malayalam was not a case of a successful cosmopolitan vernacular. It's just a local vernacular, essentially disguised itself or dressed itself up as, kind of gussied itself up as, in Sanskrit clothing to make it look more respectable. That's a kind of a caricature of what he says. So there are these kind of opposing views, and that therefore, in his view, when we talk about vernacularization in Asia, it only really starts in the colonial period. So for a scholar like him, vernacularization in the sense of the vernaculars as we understand them today as moderns is really something that comes out of the colonial process. And that's
you mean from Tiken?
This is Tiken's view.
Tiken.
Yes, for Tiken, yeah. And which also is worth thinking about in the case of Korean, and whether Korean vernacularization really happened at all before contact with Japanese. It's worth thinking about. And Koreans don't want to think about it, but it's worth thinking about. So that's all I have to say about the Sanskrit case. Let's move on to Latin. So it's really worth pointing out that the relevant time period here for all of these cases is essentially when Sanskrit and Latin and literary Sinitic ceased to be a mother tongue or a spoken language for anybody. That's the key point. So in the case of Latin, we're talking about medieval Latin after the Carolingian reforms of the 8th century. And again, there is a vast repertoire of texts, of relevant texts that show all kinds of this vernacular infection, but which nobody studied. So Löfstedt, a German scholar of medieval Latin, he talks about the Latin medieval, which constitute a vast field for research and one which has only just begun to be mapped. And the same complaints you hear today, not much has changed, it would seem, since he was writing in 1959. But if you're looking for these kinds of examples of national admixture in medieval Latin texts, where do you go? What kinds of genres? Well, administrative documents, legal documents, references to national products and local clothing, words for weights, measures, and currencies. Place names are obviously going to be localized somehow. And then in terms of the metaphors that are used to talk about these various kinds of, shall we say, nationalized or regionalized Latin, we saw already that Tiken talked about these little Sanskrits cloaking, or local vernaculars cloaking themselves to look like little Sanskrits, this idea of cloaking for Sanskrit. In the case of Nordic varieties of medieval Latin, this Vandvik talks about cases where the Latin idiom encompasses the vernacular like a thin shell. So again, cloaking or a thin shell, this idea that sort of trying to, essentially this Latin veneer, and yet the vernacular is kind of still poking out or leaking out or seeping out, or really kind of once in a conference, I think it was John Whitman brought this up, but a different, I guess, violent metaphor would be if you think of the scene in the first Alien movie where the alien pops out of the guy's chest. It's sort of like, there's this idea that the vernacular is trying to break through or break through this kind of Latin veneer. But anyway, in the case of Latin, the most common metaphors going back to the 15th and 16th century are culinary. And so you have this idea of kitchen Latin, or is it Latino culinario or something like that in Italian, seems to come out of 15th century Italy. And then, which is where we also have this idea of macaronics. And so Teofilo Folengo, 16th century, described macaronic poetry as coming from macarones, which are a certain dough made up of flour, cheese, and butter, thick, coarse, and rustic. Thus, macaronic poems must have nothing but fat, coarseness, and gross words in them. So this is to describe this particular form of Italian Latinate macaronic poetry, which of course was very parodic and humorous, but it doesn't have to be the case for this kind of mixing. But there's another book by an English scholar called Wenzel, where he shows a typical kind of really burlesque example here. So this is, if you follow this little poem, Boyibus kissibus pretty girlorum, girlibus likibus wanti samorum. I don't know if you can follow that, but this is a kind of very tongue-in-cheek, pseudo-Latin macaronic kind of poem. But there's I think he's Swedish anyway. Lars Johansson is a scholar of the Turkic languages and Persian, but he has a wonderful book on what he calls written language intertwining, where he talks about mixed verse, where you get verses that mix two languages together. And he says that these kinds of verses, in some cases, can mark the multilingual starting point of a significant literary development. And then this Wenzel, who has written a wonderful book about sermons from late medieval England, where they are also a mixture of Latin and basically Middle English. But these are not parodic, they're not meant to be humorous. This is very serious church sermons. And so he says these kinds of sermons, of which he has found a great many, he says these challenge the traditional view of a strict separation of Latin versus vernacular preaching according to audience, because the texts that he found are really very heavily vernacularized. And finally, in the same lines, and this goes back to the title of this chapter, there's quite a literature out there in both Spanish and French about something called Latin farci, which means stuffed Latin. Yeah, I mean, and so the metaphor is like a stuffed pepper. Yeah, it's like, you take a big pepper and you put lots of meat, ground up meat in it. Yeah. And this is a kind of Latin that is found in legal charters from the 10th to the 12th centuries in southern France. And so these two French scholars, Belmont and Vieillard, they say the symbiosis between Latin and vernacular owed not to a deficient knowledge of Latin, but to the ritual strength of the words effectively spoken in these essentially legal documents. So in other words, the traditional attitude towards these kind of texts was, some ignorant schmuck wrote these texts. Some ignoramus who knew nothing about Latin wrote it, and it's kind of bad Latin and it's ignorant Latin. But in fact, no, there's another way to look at it, which is that there were other reasons for it to have been written the way it was. And in this case, they're arguing for this idea of the ritual strength of spoken oaths, and that was kind of carried over into the Latin. So still on this topic of stuffed Latin or Latin farci, when you look at these texts, there are various cues that kind of give away the vernacular parts. So obviously orthography and phonology that violates the classical sort of Ciceronian Latin norms gives it away. But then there's also patent and massive lexical interference, local, regional words in the text. And the scholar who in many ways has done the most to shed light on a lot of this is Roger Wright in his book, Late Latin and Early Romance in Spain and Carolingian France. And he says he's interested in looking what happens to writing systems that survive into periods when two things happen. One, the speech with which they were originally intended to correspond has sort of essentially gone off the rails. And so he's talking, again, after the Carolingian reforms, which fixed a certain kind of spelling and a certain kind of artificial pronunciation, when in fact, the early versions of French and Spanish and Italian were already differing substantially from Latin. even from vulgar Latin. But then secondly, also at a time when the proportion of people in society who were able to write has decreased substantially, meaning that the skill to do so was only in the hands of professionals. So he's talking 10th to 12th century.
You mean write Latin?
Latin, to write Latin. And so he's writing about 10th century Spain, where he says the earlier phonographic orthography of Latin, by this point in time, by the 10th century, he says, was Latin writing was probably taught and learnt in an essentially logographic manner, which is a very radical claim to make. So in other words, he's saying that already by the 10th century in Spain, they were kind of reading Latin the way that we in modern English read modern English. Because if you think about modern English, spelling is nothing like what it looks on the page. Words like rough and tough, and the famous example of how do you spell fish? G-H-O-T-I, the G-H as in rough and T-I as in ration or nation. These kinds of changes were already happening in 10th century Spain. And so as a sort of example, he says, probably already in the 10th century, if you saw this word ipsa on the page in 10th century Spain, they were looking at that and they were vocalizing, they were reading out loud, esa. And if they saw the word super, they were actually reading it as sobre. And if they saw the name Petrus, they were reading it Pedro. So this is a kind of vernacularization hidden underneath what is a morphographic or logographic writing system, or what has become that.
But how can you say that?
So hang on. So I mean, but the point is that you find this through other kinds of spelling errors and phonographic kind of deviations in other written texts. So he says reading aloud could have used old Leonese phonetics, even for such apparently Latinate material as a legal document. And so these Latin farci, those documents are sort of, again, a kind of evidence that this was going on. And he gives another a sort of full example of a whole paragraph and how it was probably pronounced, even though it looked like it was in Latin. But what he says is that these scribes were not fools. They weren't bad at Latin. He says they worked intelligently in a difficult context where the written language as taught was ever diverging from the one that they spoke. Second. So if we just summarize, before we get to East Asia, then let me just summarize some of the points so far. So in terms of first languages, it's a key point to remember that in the periods that we're talking about, Sanskrit and Latin were not a first language for anybody. Secondly, this kind of hybridization was neglected. Yes?
For the Romans, Latin was?
No, not by the 10th century.
Oh, by the 10th century.
I'm talking about, medieval, right? So after the Carolingian reforms. So these kinds of texts and these phenomena were neglected both back then and today by scholars today. And that neglect was accompanied by and based in a kind of denigration of what is perceived as hybridization. Then we've seen that there are these various metaphors of mixing, some of them culinary or comestible, this idea of kitchen Latin or Latin farci. But although in South Asia, you do get this lapidary metaphor, and then what's also different about South Asia was that it was also highly theorized in a way that it wasn't in, say, Europe or in East Asia. Excuse me for me. We've talked about this idea of registers on a Klein or a kind of spectrum that seems to have been out there in the minds of the local actors at the time. So were the languages that we today think to be genetically unrelated, were they truly separate in the minds of those who used them? Is worth to keep in mind. Could they have been perceived by local actors in pre-modern literary cultures as lying on one and the same spectrum? And there's evidence that certainly was the case. Then script and writing system. Well, first of all, Sanskrit was not fussy about script. You could write Sanskrit in multiple different scripts. There was no one particular script that was reserved for writing in Sanskrit. But morphography, meaning like, logography or kind of Sinitic type writing, that kind of writing never seems to have developed in the Sanskrit world. However, it was possible. There are cases of script mixing. So exactly in the Dravidian South, there are cases where sometimes the Sanskrit would be written in one script, and then the local vernacular Dravidian elements would be written in another script. And there's research about that. And then in the case of Latin, Latin only ever used one script, namely the Latin script. But, and this again is Roger Wright, he says the Carolingian reforms were specifically directed towards not representing speech. It was a sort of ossification. And so these spellings ossified while the Romance vernaculars developed, until you reach a point where Latin orthography came to function morphographically, allowing for vernaculars to be represented in what ends up resembling the stuffing leaking out of a stuffed pepper or something like that. That's kind of the metaphor. And then the diagnostics for these, how do you recognize them, or how can you tease out some of these details? Well, there are these telltale features we've talked about. They tend to be spelling and phonology. And there is this tendency in some research nowadays to try and rehabilitate these scribes who traditionally have been looked at both, I think both in traditional times and by modern scholars as just being stupid and just being bad at Latin, and that maybe it's more complicated. We've talked about what kinds of genres are most hospitable to these kinds of hybridizations, and they tend to have been administrative, commercial, and legal texts, but also narrative, tales, fiction, sermons, and even verse. We have these macaronic verses, and sometimes there's this claim we've seen that cosmopolitan vernacular versification or prosody can sometimes find its way into verse. Yes, Vincenza.
Regarding this rehabilitation of scribes,
yeah.
Of course, I'm not an expert in that, so it's something that I've got from reading, studying all over the years in Italy, and but scribes were never looked down upon from the outside. Scribes were usually also the ones that produced these unique books during the 12th century, 11th, 12th century, with the miniatures and everything. So they maybe in all their lives, they, produced 2 or 3 books maximum because of the complexity of the book at that time. So I've never really studied or conceived or felt that they were conceived in need of rehabilitation in my culture.
Right. So let me
this is funny.
Well, then I think you and I are using the word scribe in 2 different ways. I guess what I should be saying, or another way to say what I mean to say, is that there has been traditionally a tendency amongst scholars, both traditional pre-modern scholars and modern scholars, when they encounter some of these texts like these 10th to 12th century charters in stuffed Latin, to say, oh, whoever wrote this text was terrible at Latin. And so I'm not having in mind the professional scribe who writes out a beautiful codex, who was in all likelihood a very serious scholar of Latin. So I guess maybe instead of scribe, copyist or author, or so I'm not meaning to target these kind of very highly specialized producers of illuminated texts, for example. Yeah. So it's just this idea that whoever produced this kind of hybridized Latin obviously didn't know his Latin properly. That attitude seems to have been prevalent. So scribe might not be the right word.
Maybe copiers,
or something like that. So so scribe might be a misleading term for me to use.
Okay.
Yeah. So and then again, how do we tell a difference between a vernacularized cosmopolitan as opposed to a newly risen cosmopolitan vernacular? what facilitates or hinders the development from the former to the latter. Could morphographic writing make it either unnecessary or more difficult for a vernacularized cosmopolitan to sublimate, and this is a term that comes out of some Japanese research, into a cosmopolitan vernacular. So in other words, when we move to East Asia, the fact that East Asian, signography is truly morphographic and logographic, does that actually occlude or hide from us a lot of the details that might have been happening beneath the surface? But although we still see some of that already with Latin, if we follow Roger Wright's sort of story. Sure. So that's kind of some of the issues so far. So let's then move to East Asia. And if we talk about so-called variant Sinitic in Japan and Korea, we can start with Japanese morphographic writing. This is where we have the most research. And so some of you might be familiar with this term hentai kambun. This is what modern day scholars and indeed people on the street even tend to call this kind of hybridized text in Japan. But there's a brand new book just out a couple of years ago by Gordian Schreiber in the same series, by the way, that I'm editing. It's based on his dissertation from Bochum, very interesting thesis. Where he complains. He says that this term hentai kambun, and one of the points of his book is to say, let's not use this term anymore. It's not a good term. He says that it implies that these texts are hybrid or somehow are deviations. This pyeon, the character, the hen of hentai, that they're deviations from a Chinese norm instead of just approaching them as an original writing style for Japanese. Is kind of one of his points. But so if you look at modern day terms in Japan that to talk about this so-called genre of hentai kambun, these texts that are sort of Japanized in one way or another, first of all, you encounter these metaphors of mixing. I'm assuming that some of your students might know a little bit of Japanese, but so there's kana majiribun, and this majiri here means to mix, right? That's a mixing metaphor. Or over here on the right, the wa kan konkobun, or in Korean honhyo again meaning mixing up. So these are terms talking about mixing, and then or you have a bunch of terms that have to do with localization and the fact that they're Japanized. So this first one, wa yo kambun tai, the wa meaning Yamato or Japan. So this would be Japanese style, hanmun. The second one, koku bunyaku. So this would be local, as in our nation, our nation's, following our nation's literary context. But this idea, koku bun here, meaning it's koku, Japanese. Then the next one, waka kambun, where again Yamato-ified or Japanifized or Japanized kambun. Below that, wa fu, where the fu means style, or Japanese style. Then wa shu, meaning sup here, meaning so this would be hwa sup in Korean, where the sup is essentially practice. So kambun after the Japanese practice, but this shu happens to be a homophone with this character in Japanese. This is also wa shu kambun. In Korean, it'd be hwa chi, where chi is like a stench or a bad smell. Which is a term that was made up by Ogyu Sorai, essentially the first sort of theorist, the first Japanese or the most prominent, early modern theorist in Japan of linguistic modernity, who was thinking about this and thinking about the way Japanese would write kambun, and finding that there were these certain texts would smell Japanese because it's in kambun, but it smells Japanese because the word order is off, or they're using the character in a wrong way, blah, blah, blah. And so that's sort of the earliest term in Japan that we have of a kind of pejorative approach to this kind of text. So then again, these are modern terms, modern day 20th century, 21st century terms. Gikambun, gi here meaning like to imitate or like, I guess imitate it. It's trying to be kambun, but it's not. Same with giji hambun, sort of pseudo hambun, or down here, jun kambute, jun here meaning like quasi, not quite. Hambun or ese, like this says like saibi in Korean, but here just the sabi, meaning trying to be, but not isn't really. So again, pseudo, fake hambun.
Yes and no.
Yeah, exactly. And then, or these metaphors of deviance or irregularity. So henkaku, no, pyeongkyak in Korean, pyeongkyak, meaning that it's kind of off the rails or deviant from some norm. This next one, hikambun, meaning it's just not hambun, it's non-hambun, yeah. And then mi-suk, so Japanese mijuku would be sort of not quite ripe or immature, kind of. You see all these terms out there in this very wide scholarship in Japanese about these kinds of texts. So can we find local Japanese terminology or meta-grammatological discourses or metaphors that index anxiety or embarrassment about admixture or hybridity before Ogyu Sorai? And I'm not aware of any such attitude. In other words, I'm not aware that before Ogyu Sorai, the Japanese were worried about this at all. I can't find any references to it, which is not to say that they're not there, but if they are, they're very hard to find and have not been picked up on in the secondary literature.
Let's say not yet.
Yeah, let's say that, yeah. But which is a big difference with Korea, as we'll see.
Yeah.
So then let's see. So this book by Schreiber, which I'm mentioning, he sets out a bunch of parameters that would help characterize the writing style of a Japanese text. So what scripts are deployed? Is it kanji, hiragana, katakana, or a mix of these? What about the calligraphic style? Is it regular, like kaiti, or is it semi-cursive, or is it graph style? How big are the graphs? Are they regular size? Are they reduced? Is it functioning just to show the sound, or is it morphography, more sort of towards logography, writing words or morphemes? And then what kinds of phonograms, if they're deploying phonograms, what kinds? And then writing order. So is it written sequentially or is it non-sequential? I'll come back to that in a minute. And then, is it underspelled, overspelled? So he has a very nice typology of how to approach this in the case of Japanese texts, but it's actually also useful for thinking about texts from Korea that are in sinographs. Yes.
I don't understand point 6.
Hang on. So here. Let me do it right now. So what is non-sequential writing? So in a Japanese hentai kanbun, so-called texts, this sequence of these two kanji here, so I guess it'd be well, let's do it in Korean. Fuji, right? It does not know. This was read as shirazu in Japan. This, in other words, in Japanese, the verb stem is on the left. It's shiru, and then the negation element is on the right. That's the azu. So it's the exact reverse word order. But the point is that that in Japanese style, let's call it just hentai kanbun for now, that a unit like this, this fuji, was perceived as if it was one unit, and it was read en bloc, and they had a kind of mental script or a mental formula or a mental program which knew that you had to change it around and read it as shirazu in Japanese. And there are many other grammatical elements besides this negative pu, which forced this kind of construction in Japanese. And Schreiber's book spends a lot of time on this. So, and again, if we talk about what kind of genres you can find this kind of Japanized kanbun in, first of all and foremost, courtier diaries, of which there are a great many in Japan, hundreds of them. Buddhist sermons, so back to the sermon more again, Buddhist temple histories and confessions, prayers, and a lot of Buddhist texts of different kinds, imperial proclamations, letters and bureaucratic documents, petitions, etc., is where you find the.
So all highly literary.
Well, yeah, I guess depending on how you define literature.
Literacy, sorry.
Yeah. Literate. Yeah. Yeah.
Literacy.
So then again, and you asked this earlier, Vincenzo, how do we know how they actually vocalized these things? Whether it was a 12th century text from, in Old Leonese that looks like Latin, or whether it's a text from Japan in kanji, how do we know how it was read or vocalized? Well, first of all, protocols for reading such texts as Japanese as opposed to as Chinese must have been widespread and must have been internalized from an early date. We know this because of the tradition of Kambun Kunten, of glossing. But on the other hand, Schreiber in his book, and this is where I have a difference with him, he rejects the idea of a hybrid third space along some spectrum. And in other words, he doesn't, well, he seems to be arguing that because these texts never had Kunten glossing in them that tells you to switch the word order or tells you which vernacular ending or particle to insert, that therefore they can't be treated as kundoku. But the lack of kundoku glosses in these texts does not make them different, in my view, from the case of Kambun Kundoku. His data show that morphographically written Japanese texts were read with the same kinds of algorithms, but they were just internalized and not written out. So a lot of this was people were doing this in their heads. And we know this from Korea too. Just because a text doesn't have kugya, Korean glossing in it, doesn't mean that the Koreans, when they read it, weren't applying those algorithms in their head. So this is, I think, where, Schreiber is kind of attacking David Lurie and Vibeke Denica in his book, because they somewhere they claim, oh, you cannot define these texts on linguistic terms alone, and he sort of is accusing them of conflating language and writing, and I don't think that's what they're doing, but that's another story. So now, okay, that's Japan, and I recommend that book by Schreiber if you're really interested in the gory details of hentai kambun. What about variant Sinitic in Korea? So again, let's look at modern day terms for Korean variant Sinitic. We'll start with Japanese scholarship, because that's where the scholarship starts. It was the Japanese scholars in the colonial period who first started commenting on this. So this Ayukai Fusano Shin, he talked about what he called Zoku Kambun, which is not a very good term, where the Zoku just means popular or something like popular or local or something like that. And then we have a fabulous paper from 1978 by Fujimoto Yukio, where he just calls it Chosen Kambun, Chosen, literary Sinitic. And this is a really important paper from that by Fujimoto. Then coming more recently, Okimori Takuya talks about Pagyo Hanmun, where this pa is to destroy and kyuk is a norm. So it's basically iconoclastic Hanmun or norm destroying Hanmun. And he also talks about what he calls Hanhwa Hanmun, which would be, I guess, Koreanized or Hanified Hanmun. And then Ito Hideto, who is the same age as me, he talks about Pyeonchik Hanmun, which isn't this the same Pyeonchik in soccer, where if you commit a foul, isn't that a Pyeonchik? It's the same, I think, in other words, it's like, anyway, it's breaking the rules, it's changing the rules. It's kind of it's a linguistic foul, if you will. That's the term he uses. But again, none of these terms are particularly widespread. Let me get my cursor back where I need it. And then if we go to Korean scholarship, again, there's a wide variety of terms. Nam Pung Hyun is a big expert on this. He talks about Hanguk Hanmun, so Korean Hanmun. Kim Young-wook tried to get this term Hanmun with the Han Nara Han, which of course is never going to work because it's a homophone with the other Han, so no one uses that. Hwang Wi-ju talks about Hanguk-shik Hanmun. Shim Kyung-ho, who's I'm a big fan of his work, and he is one of the few bona fide Hanmun scholars in Korea who has paid any attention to this kind of text. He talks about Pyeongyuk Hanmun, sort of, again, norm changed or anomalous, if you will, anomalous Hanmun. Choi Yeon-sik basically works on Shilla Buddhism, and he talks about Shilla-shik Hanmun, because a lot of our most interesting surviving texts of this nature are from Shilla.
You mean does he refer to the Yanga?
No, this is referring specifically to
Buddhist
epigraphy,
Buddhist
Buddhist
text.
texts or also just epigraphy, inscriptions. Kim Gi-jong, who's a Buddhologist, and Pak Sung-jong, who's an expert on Idu, they talk about Pyeonche Hanmun, which is really just the Korean pronunciation of hentai kanbun that the Japanese use. And then we have North Korean scholars who, as of 2002, are extremely focused on this kind of text. It's a whole nother story. I have a paper on this that's in press now, on essentially how the North Korean scholars have decided that the Shillo, the veritable records of the Chosun dynasty, are in fact written in a unique form of Hanmun that the Koreans alone could have figured out, and that this is Chosunshik Hanmun. And they've also done all kinds of other, sometimes interesting, sometimes crazy work on this idea of Chosunified Hanmun, but that's another story. So those are some of the terms you see from Korea. And then in terms of the metaphors, well, locality and irregularity are mostly emphasized, but the terminology is kind of in flux, though there's no agreed upon terminology in South Korea. And in reality, there aren't a huge number of scholars working on this because most Hanmun scholars focus on the very highest, Hanshi and whatever is in the Tongmunsan kind of thing. So
That's the canon.
yeah, that's what
That's
they
the
focus on.
literary
And
canon.
essentially they're focused on showing how it was just as good as anything that was being written in China. That's kind of the anyway. So Korean variances. So then in terms of pre-20th century ideologies of language and writing on the Korean peninsula, if we go back to Shilla times, so the Uisang, when he was complaining about the way some of his students were writing up his lectures and his sermons, he says, oh, they mixed in local speech. And the Hanja there, chap I pang-un. Pang-un, not meaning dialect as in the modern term, but meaning local speech.
Yes.
And the key word is chap, the chap of chapche, mixed, yes. So this is a key word. Igubo in Koryo talks about pang-un I. There it is again, local speech, rustic words. This ri is, I think, means something like mallicha maybe, or I can't remember. Anyway, it means really rustic and sort of countryside. And when he was describing the way that certain writers, when they wrote Hanmun, would infuse their Hanmun with this kind of, which is to be frowned upon. And then you have another, I believe this is a Shilla text, a Shilla Buddhist text. So the postface, the Palmun, says, as they were preparing this text, which again was based on, I think, lectures by one of the, might have been Uisang, I can't remember, I don't have the notes in front of me. But the point is that whenever they would write up these Buddhist masters, these Korean Buddhist masters, lectures or sermons, that they would all the notes would be full of vernacular, but they would then clean them up into pristine Hanmun. And so that was called sak pangon sak. Sak here is the idea of sak, to scrape away, or I think it's the sak of sakje, like to delete. And so they would delete or remove the local language annotations. And so this sak is another keyword that occurs repeatedly right away, all the way through the end of Chosun, when talking about how Hanmun texts were edited before they were put into Munjit, because you wanted to sak all of the all of the Pangon Iya before it could be legitimate Hanmun text.
So this was a kind of Chonghua.
Yes.
On the contrary.
Yes, this was getting rid of the local. So there it is. The keywords that again, starting from Shilla all the way to the end of Chosun, you get these as chap for admixture, pangon iyo, local speech, rustic words, and then this idea of paring, trimming, excising, purging the local, purging the vernacular.
Regarding the pangon iyo, or this bang on or hyang on hyang, or the Samguk Sagi is full of these expressions.
Yeah.
When they refer to even to place names.
Yes.
Written in.
Yes.
Hyang or
Right.
Hyang on.
Right.
So it's full of these
Yes.
expressions.
Yes. So I mean, they're obviously very attuned to the differences. But it's the chap that was the problem, and to solve it, you had to suck it, basically. Sakko. And then in the Chosun dynasty is the first time we see this term on, which oftentimes modern day Korean script nationalists, as I like to call them, try to tell this story that the word on is inherently pejorative and negative, and it's not. It just means vernacular. It just means local. And so we first see this in the Chosun dynasty. So there's this idea that onmun was a very disparaging word. It wasn't. It's just meant it was the local script. Anyway, moving on to the next page. So
if they are nationalists, sorry if I'm always interrupting, but the concept of onmun actually should be stronger for nationalists.
Yes, so they should embrace it. Yeah, but they don't.
They embrace the onmun
I know.
thing.
Yeah, well, the sort of standard narrative, I think, has some problems. So Ijun, and this is just it's easy to find other statements like this from Chosun. But he says, the reason I want to remove local speech, Pangon, from Munjip, from scholars' collected writings, is that generally speaking, the collected works of our nation's famous writers will be sought out for purchase by Chinese and will not circulate exclusively domestically. So this is a bit of a fantasy. I mean, it was only very rarely that Munjip or writings by Chosun scholars ever circulated outside of Chosun, but there was nonetheless this very strong consciousness that somebody might be looking over their shoulder from China, and that therefore whatever especially if it was something that was going to be carved onto printing blocks. Manuscript, no problem, but if it was going to be printed on blocks, it had to be pristine. It had to follow all the rules of Hanmin.
Well, there are cases, literary cases, in which Korean texts, not in Korean but in Hanmin, were an enormous success in China.
Absolutely, there were. But
so
I mean,
there was again, so Hanmin, so it might have been part of this circle of.
Might have been, but those are exceptional cases. I mean, so you have Honan Sarhan's works, for example, and there were others more in later Chosun, which is like 18th or 19th century. So
the Chegyong-chang, Ital, the three poets in Tang style.
Was this back in Koryo, you mean?
No. They were not early Joseon. They were at the time of Hongnan. Chegyong-chang is 1560.
There were such cases. It's true. There were such cases. And who knows, maybe more such cases will come to light. But for 90% of Koreans producing Munjip, the chances that they would be read in China were minuscule.
Well, I would expect Ipang or Yulgok or some other guys, big guys like that.
Well, you might expect, but again, I think sometimes the expectations are inflated on the part of both modern day Koreans and Koreans at the time, because the reality is that the Chinese just didn't care, and they don't today, and they didn't then. Yeah.
And maybe so. Ijun was a medical expert. Was he the medical expert?
I don't. I'd have to go look him up. I don't think this is a medical context, though. I'd have to go back and look at my paper, which I don't have in front of me. But anyway, my point is that you could find numerous other literati from Chosun in any century writing like this. So there was this very strong conscientiousness that they had to be careful. Okay, or here's another one. Vincenza.
Sorry.
So here's another one. So the Kim Chun-tek, who obviously is a big name in literary studies, essentially writing about what is acceptable in the way of local elements to put into a Hanmun text in Korea. So he says, I have never seen the use of appellations like Hyungju, where this chu is meant to represent nim. So a Korean would look at this and read it Hyungnim in Chosun, or Sukju, with the same suffix nim. I've never seen the use of this nim essentially in letters cause any harm to writing in Sinitic, but, and then this is where he gets very, he says, but so-called idu should never be used under any circumstances. This is because, generally speaking, individual names cause no damage to a composition, but if you use idu, Sinitic cannot be true. And the Hanmun, I should have given the Hanmun, it says the moon cannot function in a, something like moon, pulung, moon or something. Moon can't be moon if you're doing this. So there were these notions as to what was kosher and what was not in a text. This is more mid-Chosun. These kinds of statements have Shim Kyung-ho has been good about collecting a lot of this.
And now again, regarding this, could it be because of this that we do not find, or we rarely find, because you also wrote a chapter in
about Idu literature,
this Idu literary text. Could it be the reason why we don't have so many Idu literary texts?
For sure. Yeah, no, these were very strong sort of ideological stands on what could be written and how. And of course, a lot has probably been lost. But yeah, this was the Idu always got was very pejorated. Yeah, this was
administrative.
Okay, so then again, what about genres? Where do we go? And I'm talking about pre-Chosun here because I have there's a separate chapter in this volume about Chosun. Well, of course, for which we have many more sources. But so for pre-Chosun, where do we go to find Korean variant Sinitic or so-called Chosun-shik Hanmun? Well, basically three places. Mokkan, wooden tablets, of which there are very few from Korea. And of course, they're very short, so they're not very helpful for this kind of thing. Epigraphy, which are the inscriptions, and then Buddhist texts on paper is where we can find for pre-Chosun. And the earliest...
Sorry, why not Hyanga?
Hyanga is vernacular.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Hyanga doesn't count.
Yeah,
Hyanga is
in
not,
that sense, yes.
Hyanga is not Hanmun. And so obviously the idea is that everybody has combed through the very earliest inscriptions from Goguryeo for any traces of the vernacular in those inscriptions. And this is an example from Ito Hideto's work, where this particular Pimun, the Chungwon Goguryeo Pimun from 495, has Korean word order in it, right? And he spells it out. So where 1, 2, 3, 4 in the Chinese text comes out 1, 2, 3, 4 like this. It's a direct. The word order is exactly the same as it would be in Korean, which would not happen if it was truly Hanmun. But these kinds of examples are quite rare in Goguryeo inscriptions. The North Koreans have claimed to find examples of even Idu in the Goguryeo Hwangeto stele, because there's so many controversies about that stele and how it was allegedly tweaked by the Japanese, and of course the North Koreans have read into it, things that aren't there, and that's all very controversial. But the Koreans the North Koreans want to find Idu in that inscription from 414, I think, because then they can claim that Idu was invented in North Korea. You see, and so there's this kind of stuff going on. But so anyway, inscriptions, we have something like 270 inscriptions from the three kingdoms in unified Shilla, but very few of them contain Idu or variant Sinitic elements. Even fewer are written out entirely in Korean word order. And these have been studied to death by a small group of scholars in South Korea and studied very well.
The
Imshin Sogithok,
the best example.
It's a good one, and it belongs to a small group of such surviving examples, and they tend to be from Shilla. And then on paper, there's this text, the Hwangryong Mundap, which is preserved in Japan. which has a lot of good examples. And this is a Shilla text, I think 8th or 9th century, can't remember. But here you see this Ke Muso Chan Chagyong Neje. This is Korean word order. So 남은 것 없이 이경 안에 있다 Chagyong Neje. This is che meaning 있다, and it's Korean, right? And so this text is kind of nice for that, and it happens to be preserved in Japan. Like actually many of our best, there aren't that many in the first place, but the Shilla written sources that have these kinds of so-called variant Sinitic in them tend to be preserved in Japan. And then Kim Gi-jong lists 32 Koryo documents that have variant Sinitic. 10 are Buddhist, the rest are administrative. Administrative documents like this that have so-called Chosanji Hanmun tend to be concentrated in the late 13th and 14th centuries. And then after Koryo, the variant Sinitic in Buddhist texts tends to get replaced by Cheonggyeok or Orthodox literary Sinitic. And this major cultural shift in Korean Buddhist Sinitic texts is already well underway by mid-Koryo and seems to also align with the point in time when the older interpretive Kugyol, the Sakdok Kugyol, which made you do these mental gymnastics by changing the word order and sending you back to in the text, that when that shifts to Sundok or to sequential, so these seem to happen at about the same time. And then again, Kyunyo, another case of a famous monk who gave lectures. His students recorded them, and they were recorded. They were written down in the Pangon, in the vernacular. And of course, he also was one of the authors of these Hyanga. But when he prepared his lectures, when his lectures were prepared for printing a century and a half later, it's noted that they personally excised, they Chin Sak Pangon, somebody, whoever was in charge, Chikchup, whatever, they got rid of. Again, this is this Sak, and then the postface to Kyunyo's this thing, the Hwanggyong Sambo Jangwon Tonggi, they talk about Sak Raon. They got rid of the Shilla speech. So this is already in Koryo. So this the claim is then that by the mid 13th century in Koryo, vernacularized literary Sinitic had come to be perceived as a kind of literary relic from Shilla times.
But this confirms that during Shilla, so during all, Shilla, Pekje, Koryo, there must have been many attempts to vernacularize.
Absolutely.
With the only system, the only
absolutely.
writing system that they had at their disposal.
Exactly.
They were trying to write the spoken language.
Yes.
Yeah.
And of course, the shame is that so little has survived, but there must have been much more. Yeah. Although there's some controversy as to the extent to which this kind of vernacularized Sinitic was popular in Pekje. It's more Koguryo, Shilla. The claim has been that Pekje, because it was closer aligned with China, somehow it had less of it, or there's just less that survives. But I mean, we just don't know.
Well, but many more Mokan are being excavated,
Yes,
and they might have
an
answer
to
this.
Yeah, and again, the where Korea counts its Mokan in the hundreds, Japan counts its Mokan in the tens of thousands, but the Korean ones are at least 1 century earlier than the Japanese ones. So that's one advantage, but we need to find more. So let's see, I think we're almost at the end here. So by way of conclusions, and there are really no firm conclusions at all, but I'm just trying to think now how this positions us to think about Korean sources, right? Localized versions of erstwhile cosmopolitan codes were perceived everywhere as inferior and hybridized varieties. That seems to be clear. Audiences for these kinds of texts were obviously local, and sometimes the intent was for more popularized reception or consumption, which would make sense. The result was often a kind of insider register that was opaque to outsiders. And I see this today even with these Yadam texts, where sometimes my Chinese colleagues will look at that and they go, "This is terrible Chinese. They couldn't write Chinese at all." Well, no, they weren't trying to write Chinese. You know, they were trying to write something else. And
The readers, the audience.
they knew
was
how to,
not
yeah, they didn't,
Chinese.
yeah, they didn't have a problem with it. But so anyway, opaque to outsiders, right? The metagrammatical commentary, both then in pre-modern times and today, frequently deploys metaphors of mixing that range from culinary to lapidary to olfactory. If you remember the what was it, the washu, the pachi, yeah. So sometimes as a joke, when I'm reading these texts with my students, we talk about, oh, yeah, this Korean Hanmun text smells like kimchi. Because sometimes you have kimchi Hanmun, but no one has proposed such a term. And then, or else just calling them mixed, just chop. And then the degrees of self-consciousness about admixture can vary. So I just don't find any evidence, by Koryo and Chosun times, there is evidence, good evidence, lots of evidence, of real genuine anxiety about the quality of their Hanmun and about a localized Sinitic, but you just don't find that in Japan. And there are obvious reasons for that, because they didn't have exams.
But also one biggest evidence, maybe the most famous evidence, is the opposition by Chen Li to the alphabet. To the alphabet.
Yeah, sure.
That starts from there. He's
that's a classic.
The father of everything.
For sure. So modern day scholars of such texts often, I should say sometimes, appeal to the notion of registers on a spectrum, which is a view that I kind of hold to, this idea that there's a spectrum of vernacular all the way up to, Cosmopolitan, and that you can just place texts on there rather than just two different languages, right? But which is potentially problematic, at least to a modern day mind, but it forces us to confront the fact that local or contemporary actors tended to perceive their inscriptional practices as lying on one and the same spectrum. And then writers could drift in and out of the Cosmopolitan code, and not just inadvertently. So Pollock always emphasizes that vernacularization is a conscious choice, but writing in a localized Sanskrit or variant Sinitic could also be a conscious choice and willful act. It must have been. Modern day scholarship appears to have been just as negligent and sometimes equally dismissive of texts in regionalized Cosmopolitan codes as were the commentators in traditional times.
Do
you want to go back?
Please go back.
Yeah.
Can you lower the?
Oh, sorry.
Bar?
Yes.
Because I have a question regarding the third point.
Yes.
Maybe it's my knowledge of English, but what is the difference between a conscious choice and a willful act?
Oh, there's no difference. In my English, there's no difference.
Oh. Okay.
I'm just trying to mix up I don't want to use the same word twice.
Okay.
Yeah, just like in Hanmun. Yeah.
Okay.
So the key features of Cosmopolitan vernaculars posited by Pollock apply only piecemeal or very belatedly, if at all, to the cases of variant Sinitic in Japan and Korea. I'm not sure, maybe Japan is not so good here, but for Korea, I'm willing to stick to this. So in other words, so these are the things these are the features that Pollock says go hand in hand with the vernacularization process, especially of creating a cosmopolitan vernacular, a new literary language in the image of Sanskrit or Latin. He says, first of all, philologization and the production of difference. This means the creation of dictionaries and grammars. We didn't have that in Korea, zero, right? Other than the exception being dictionaries, okpyeon, where we do see an attempt to highlight Sino-Korean pronunciations as opposed to Chinese. That's true. So we have a little bit of philology.
When was the first okpyeon?
Oh, I'm not sure. That's a good question. I couldn't tell you.
Because I've seen those of
Yeah.
today.
Yeah. But 18th
I've never
century,
asked.
18th century is when suddenly, after you get palatalization in, tea goes to chi kind of thing.
Yes.
And then the Koreans kind of, our Hanja are closer to antiquity than Mandarin. And they're proud of that. That's really interesting. And so that goes into the dictionaries. But anyway, so the philologization and the production of difference, you don't really get much of that in Korea. Literary exaltation of the vernacular, you don't see at all in Korea. And then literary territorialization, or what he calls the miniaturization of the cosmopolitan within the new vernacular world. And you don't see that either. You see it in Korea, in Chosun Sinitic verse, Hanshi, the 8 gorgeous views of I don't know, Kwandong or something, where you get, there's 8 gorgeous views of something in China. You download that and you talk about it here, but not in vernacular so much, in Sinitic. Anyway, so you don't really see these kinds of classic, what Pollock calls the classic kind of features of vernacularization. You don't see in Chosun. Well, so my question is, was vernacularization in Korea until the 1890s, until the Kabul reforms, and at least if we're talking about among the sinographically literate elites, was it really just sinification or sinicization with the superposed cosmopolitan code and its script serving as a cloaking mechanism for the vernacular? And here you find, and this is a different kind of topic, and I have a recent chapter about the way Koreans read the Shishanji, where I talk about this, but all this experimentation with using Hanja to write vernacular words in the 18th and 19th centuries, and even into the first decade of the 20th century, you find Hanmun Soso written in some of the newspapers that are highly vernacularized. But where the focus seems to have been to the bitter end with these traditionally educated elites to be vernacular, but damn it, we're going to do it using Hanja, and so that was kind of a dead end in vernacularization in Korea.
But again, I think this happens because the writing system's difference was so enormous, and
between Hangul and Hanja.
Yeah,
possibly.
I mean, what Pollock observed. Well, in India, again, it's different but he spoke about Sanskrit, and maybe he didn't even pay too much attention to according to what you said before, if I recall well, he didn't really pay too much attention to the writing system.
That's right.
And then in Latin and all other European languages that took the Latin alphabet as a writing system, this difference does not exist. And this, enormous mountain that they have to overcome,
Sure.
this kind of huge difficulty does not exist in the literature, both in Latin or in all kinds of Macheronico, Latino Macheronico.
Sure.
So this might be because of this reason that these 3 items set by Pollock are not really
but true. But I guess
one of the
one of the reasons for sure. I think we have to be careful not to ascribe the differences between vernacularization in Korea and in Europe or India. We have to be careful not to ascribe those differences to a simple kind of technical script problem, because the ideological side of it was so important. Because if they really had wanted to, they had the tools at their disposal, the tool, namely the Hunmin Jeongeum, to vernacularize in the 15th century already. I think definitely writing system is a huge factor, and Pollock definitely ignores it in his work. But what I find interesting is that to the bitter end, the sinographically educated elite who were truly interested in vernacular. Already from the 18th century, there were, we see in literature these attempts to, these akbu that are focused on the local and local history and
But
local
they
things.
translate the
Yeah,
akbu, they
but it's
translate.
they can only conceive of doing it or of doing it in a lasting way in Sinitic, in Hancha, in Hanmun. So anyway, that's I think interesting. But of course, modern day script nationalists in Korea want to tell an underdog, a good guy, bad guy, underdog story of this Hangul emerging victorious, and of all this kind of important vernacularization work that was happening all the time behind the scenes in Chosun. And I'm not sure that that's really accurate. I think it happens very late, and obviously certain other political factors have to change. Anyway, morphographic writing, namely writing like Hancha, is a much more effective cloak for vernacular elements than phonographic writing. So oftentimes things could be hidden beneath a veneer of sinography when they're in fact meant to be vernacular, which is another problem we have. So whereas the Sanskrit Cosmopolis and Latinitas both saw the self-conscious, politically motivated creation of cosmopolitan vernaculars through the deliberate crafting of new local literary languages on the model of superimposed Sanskrit and Latin, late Chosun Korea saw exactly the opposite, is what I'm claiming. And then I think this is my final point, is that the result, and it's somewhat ironic, and it was not meant to be this way, the unwitting result was a form of literary Sinitic known as Chosun Shik Hanmun, or Chosun style Hanmun. At least today, that's a form of Hanmun that is as scandalously unstudied and untheorized as is vernacularization more generally. And so, I've got now about 4 papers about this problem of Chosun Shik Hanmun, and it's very difficult, but that's been my contribution. So I will stop there. And thank you for your attention. Let me just, I'm going to interrompi condivisione, yes?
Yeah.
And then I'm going to look at this. These are these are not questions, I guess. Okay. Okay, good. I can ignore that. Okay, good. Okay. So thank you.
I have two quasi questions. Well, regarding the last thing that you said, of course there isn't, and of course it's scandalous because everybody studies in the contemporary,
I know.
and very few people go into the pre-modern.
I know.
So this is scandalous.
Yes.
Very scandalous.
Yes.
One, even in Korea.
Yes.
Not only,
Agreed.
but even in Korea.
Agreed.
Two, and sorry for because this is a subject that really, gets me terribly. The other one is regarding Pollock and regarding, theorization.
Yes.
Done by Pollock. He speaks of literization and literarization.
Yes.
Could these two terms, could they also be interpreted as because in Korea you have a lot. Well, once the Onmun, the Huminjong is created, you have an intense activity of translation.
Yes.
Translation of books for women, books directed to women, so books of indoctrination for women, then books intended to be read by women, so in order to become better women, but that has nothing to do with the theoretical construct of Neo-Confucianism. I mean, it does, but indirectly. And then you have a huge portion of literature by women. Could it be interpreted as literization, I don't know how to pronounce it, literization, the first phase, so where you teach women how to become Confucians, how to abide by Confucian rules. And also what to do, what kind of texts and how to behave in society in order to become this. But then the literarization phase, could it be when women instructed in Onmun, and learning the alphabet and everything, then start to produce their own texts?
Yeah, I think
Could
so.
it be-
Well, I think that's actually more or less what Pollock says, because so he has these two terms, and they're
Applying to Korea.
well, yeah, but so just let's talk about his terms for a minute, and they're somewhat confusing because they sound very similar. So, literarization is the committing to writing of a language. So the first time you actually take a language and start writing it, that's literarization. Putting it in literas, in letters.
Yeah.
And then literarization is the actual use of this newly written language to produce works of literature. So, but his key
Works
point,
of
literature,
So
in creative works. But his point is that there's always a gap of at least 200, 300, or 400 years between literarization and literarization.
Yeah.
And that's also true for Korea,
But
basically.
this happens in Korea because the only thing is that they don't have the alphabet. So when they do this exercise, they start actually with Mokan, but they do it with the writing.
Right. So
system
in
that
other
they
words,
have.
Korea had already been, Korea was already literate and was already literarized before Hunmin Jeongeum. But if we're talking specifically about works in
In the
Hunmin Jeongeum,
alphabet,
there's
yes.
still a gap of a couple hundred years,
Yeah.
because you don't really have people producing original works in Hunmin Jeongeum until the 17th century. Yeah. But this is why, but for the longest time, it was claimed that the Worin Cheonganjigok and even the Yongbyo Cheonga must have been written originally in Korean, which is nonsense. They were written in Hanmun and then translated into, right? And there's good evidence for that. And so anyway, it all kind of fits his usual story for Pollock, I think.
Well, but they also say that the Yongbyo Cheonga was the first in
Vernacular, which is also not true.
Which is,
Yeah.
of course, true.
Well,
Thank you. Now
okay.
I leave.
Yeah, sure,
I leave the
sure,
floor
no.
to other questions.
So I guess, I see a hand up. Let me see if I click, it looks like it's Julia. But it's, so how do we? Introini,
No.
yes. Well, there was a hand. Oh, no, that's not a hand up. That was my pointer. Sorry, Julia. Sorry, Julia. How do I find?
Are there any questions, guys?
I guess I would see the hand up. Been a while since I used Zoom like this.
This is quite an interesting.
Well, I'm sorry, like I say, it's the first time I presented on this, and it's not an easy topic to present on. It's kind of abstract. But to go back to one thing you said about how scandalous it is that so little is done on anything pre-modern. It's not even just a question of pre-modern. So I think everybody knows that at the end of this month will be the AXE conference in Copenhagen. And there is a special panel on how to teach Hanmun at this conference. And I'm the first paper, but my paper is called First Things First. How are we going to teach Hanmun if nobody's teaching Hanja anymore? We don't even teach Hanja when we teach Korean. All of the ohakdangs in Korea, virtually all of them, when they teach Korean to foreigners, they just throw Hanja out the window. None of them teach Hanja.
Yeah.
So Europe, I mean, North America is terrible. Europe is better. The European language programs do, I think, teach some Hanja. Certainly they do in France. I think they do in Germany. I don't know about Italy.
Actually,
I think you do actually. Yeah.
We have the project is there. The idea is there for, it has been there for many years. But the thing is that we are so overloaded in Venice. We are so
you don't have
overloaded
at the time, right?
And also we don't have enough people. So this should be done, at least the practice.
Yeah.
But also, at least some part of the language teaching should go into that.
Yeah.
But the thing is that we don't have enough heads,
bodies
to
to
teach. and also, I mean, it should be done basically from, from the first year.
Right.
So when you
Right.
read, when you start Korean,
Hmm.
you start Hanmun as well. No, not Hanmun, Hanja.
Yeah,
Hanja,
yeah.
not Hanmun.
Although I
So
would
only
even
something
dispute that, but anyway, it doesn't matter as long as you're doing it at some point. Yeah.
Yeah, but among the young lecturers, the native speakers, there are people who have been not educated.
I know they don't have
so
the skill.
They cannot use
I
it.
know.
And so that's why now we are about. Maybe I shouldn't. Shall we stop recording this? We are about to select another.
They can't hear you anyway. I think
Oh,
it's
they
just
cannot.
yeah.
Well, anyway, we are about to select a third lecture.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Will happen in the next month. So it should be someone to keep
Yes.
the Hanja education. So this is now very strange that from that time on, and they did it for political reasons because in the north they had abolished the Hanja. So and now it has become the same.
Well, it's just become a political football. So you had a question.
It's more like comment. I've been to South Korea to study there last semester, and I got a chance to meet people from Paris.
Yes.
And I know that they are in their bachelor degree, they study Hanja.
Yes.
And it was very funny to see my friend at the library studying Hanja, and the Korean students nothing buying start like.
Yeah. It's quite alien to Korean.
I think it's quite important for us, especially as Korean studies students, to learn about Hanja, to learn about this very, I would say, from the modern point of view, like niche, it's a different language because I think it helps also learning.
Helps learn vocabulary.
Language.
Yeah.
Once you master like 200 characters, some words that are easy.
For sure. For sure.
But yeah, like our generation lacks this knowledge.
Okay.
Are there any questions?
Not in the chat.
Okay.
Another observation of Hanja is of course needed. It's desperately needed, and it must be kept into the language education because it's part of the language. No matter how Chongwa, Chongche you do, but you cannot make 60 or 65% of your lexicon disappear, or you cannot exchange it into it, and it's something. Even if it's not something that is happening in the next 50 or 100 years, also. So this must be taken into consideration. But also the Onmun. So we have a huge amount of documents from pre-modern Korea in Onmun. And we are not able, nobody, almost very few people are able to read it in Korea.
Yeah, I know.
In outside, no, because I'm barely starting now to recognize the letters and everything. So we need help. And there are several calligraphic styles, and there are several pieces of literature entirely written in Onmun, and we don't do anything about that either. We here and also
in Korea.
So this is really Korea seems to be Korea obliterating its past.
Yeah.
And this is something that you should not do.
I agree.
So
we agree. Yeah. It's
anyway, any questions? I mean, what? Okay. So, you have any comments? No.
I don't mind.
So basically, you agree that vernacularization. I don't know how to pronounce this term. In Korea starts.
Well, no, I wouldn't. I don't want to commit myself to any broad statement. So one of the things that Pollock said in his book in 2006, which was very provocative and uninformed, was he says that in Korea, he said that Korea never, and Vietnam for that matter, never had true vernacularization in the sense that he describes it, and that in Korea, vernacularization, despite the presence of Minjungum, was a derivative project of modernity, once it came into contact with basically. And so that, but, and that's provocative, and there's a certain amount of truth in it. But what it ignores is that Korea has been vernacularizing, from the moment that it came into contact with signography, with Chinese characters, and then developed these elaborate technologies for reading, first of all, for reading Sinitic texts through the vernacular, and then also for adapting signography to write the vernacular. So that's all part of a vernacularization process. But the actual kind of concerted attempt to produce literature and to exalt it and to philologize, the vernacular and so on, those things that Pollock talks about, those don't happen until the 20th century. Yeah. So in other words, there's a lot of vernacularization that you can't see happening below the surface, because when they're reading Sinitic texts, they're actually reading them in Korean, both in terms of their Sino-Korean Hanja but also through Sokdo Pugyal and so forth. That's a kind of vernacularization that you can't see because it's not necessarily on the page. And so that I think he misses. But in terms of big picture, yes, it's kind of true that it's very belated. Yeah.
Okay, well, I don't have any more comments.
It's been a long time since I stared at a black screen of death over Zoom, where there's just lots of names.
The other page, maybe we have some hands. No.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay. Good. Well,
we can
we can
finish here
finish.
then. We can.
Did you want to say anything?
I actually I said that already before. So I said that at the beginning. I thank them all for following the 20 this cycle of 20 special lectures. I could promise that the same will happen next year, but I think it could create some nightmares in their minds. So I won't do it. But
Okay.
we will see us again next year.
Okay.
All right. Well,
So we can
that's,
stop
yeah.
the recording.
Very good.